So, good morning, friends. So, let's start with today's session, the Hindu session, right? Hindu Bite session 28.5, our weekly series. Hope everyone is studying well. I've shared my screen with you. Okay, hope it's visible to all of you. Okay, yeah. So, the first point of discussion today is with respect to the star rating of garbage free cities. Okay, so let me take the pen. Okay. So the star rating protocol, which was launched by Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs (MOHUA) in 2018 to institutionalize a mechanism for cities to achieve garbage-free status to motivate the cities to achieve higher degrees of sustainable cleanliness. Okay, so remember important thing. Star rating of garbage-free cities. Okay, it is launched by Housing and Urban Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, right? It is one of the various initiatives which intends to make Swachh Bharat Mission Urban a successful project. Okay, so again, an important bit to be noted that it is a component of your Swachh Bharat Mission, right? This ministry has announced the results of star rating of last year. Now, out of that, whatever results have been announced, 6 cities have been given a 5-star certificate. 65 cities have been given a 3-star certificate. 70 cities have been given a 1-star certificate. Now, these 5 cities which have got, or 6 cities which have got 5-star status, they are important. Remember their names. So, which are those? One is Ambikapur. Where is it? It's in Chhattisgarh. Then Surat and Rajkot. It is there in Gujarat. Then we have Indore, which is there in Madhya Pradesh. And then we have Navi Mumbai. It's in Maharashtra. Okay, remember it's Navi Mumbai, not Mumbai. Okay, Mumbai Municipal Corporation is different, and Navi Mumbai Municipal Corporation is different. So please don't get confused. It's a different entity. Now, what are the basis of it? So whatever the star rating is there, that star rating is based on 12 different parameters which follow SMART framework. So, and what are the different things that the SMART framework of single metric, measurable, achievable, rigorous verification mechanisms and targeted outcomes. So, okay, just remember that there are 12 parameters on which this SMART framework of a star rating system has been developed. It is a comprehensive framework that assesses cities across 24 different components of solid waste management and is graded or based on the overall marks received. Okay, so with respect to solid waste management, because that is one of the major waste which is generated in the municipal areas, there are 24 different parameters. What are the procedures? The star rating is supported by self-assessment, self-verification for achieving a certain star rating. It also ensures the involvement of citizens group for a transparent system of self-declaration. Now remember this again, very important points. A nice question could be framed by using this particular data. Okay, whether the assessment is done by themselves, it's a self-assessment, or a third party is involved, or whether the citizens are involved, whether the only officials are involved. So things could be twisted, and a good question could be framed of this, right? Further, the self-declaration is further verified through an independent third-party agency appointed by MOHUA. Okay, so third party verification is there. Okay, third party verification is also there. Self assessment is there, citizens group are involved, as well as third party verification is there. Significance: the performance of cities under the star rating protocol is crucial as it carries significant weightage for their final assessment in Swachh Sarvekshan, right? So whatever rating they are getting in this star rating system, that will also help them to gain marks in their Swachh Sarvekshan. Swachh Sarvekshan is an annual urban cleanliness survey conducted by Government of India. We already know that. It also ensures certain minimum standards of sanitation through a set of prerequisites defined in the framework. Since the rating is conducted at a city level, it makes the process easier to implement and helps the cities incrementally improve their overall cleanliness. Okay, fine. See, at different levels, say at the national level, the whole country is involved. At the state level, a state is involved. So very large geographical area. But if you take one city, say Pune city or Mumbai city or Jaipur city, the geographical area is comparatively smaller, and hence accessing that becomes comparatively easier. The rating protocol is an outcome-based tool that helps the ministry and other stakeholders to evaluate cities on the basis of single rating. Okay, that's just so basically remember this star rating. These five different cities who have got, sorry, six different cities who have got 5-star rating, right? Remember the name of the ministry which is involved in this thing, and then also remember this particular thing who all are involved in this rating thing. Also remember that it is related with the Swachh Sarvekshan also. Right? Next point of discussion is India to chair WHO Executive Board. Okay, very well in news. You must have read this. So India has been elected to the World Health Organization (WHO's) executive board. Okay, so India as a country has been elected to this executive board. Okay, plus it will be holding the chairmanship of the executive board for 1 year. Okay, so we have been elected to this particular board for 3 years. So India as a country has been elected for this board for 3 years. Now, apart from India, other countries are also elected after every 3 years. Okay, to this executive board, and one amongst that country it becomes the chairperson for 1 year. The chairperson is by rotation. So this present year India is going to be the chairperson, right? Currently the chairmanship of WHO executive board is held by Japan. Okay, so the preceding right now, prior to India, it is held by Japan, and now India will be holding it. The proposal to appoint India's nominee to the executive board was signed by 194 nations at the 73rd World Health Assembly in 1819 May 2020. Okay, so all these recent developments. In 2019, WHO's Southeast Asia Group had unanimously decided that India would be elected to the executive board for a 3-year term beginning for May 2020. Okay, so India's election, whatever the campaign was there, it was totally accepted way back in 2019 itself, right? Okay. WHO member states are grouped into 6 WHO regions. Now this is important, remember this. Okay, so the regions are African region, then the region of the Americas, then Southeast Asian region, European region, Eastern Mediterranean region, and Western Pacific region. Okay, so these are the 6 regions into which WHO members have been classified into. Okay, fine. India has been elected along with 10 other countries including Botswana, Colombia, Ghana, Guinea-Bissau, Madagascar, Oman, Republic of Korea, Russia, and United Kingdoms. So these are the total countries who along with India will remain member of the World Health Organization's executive board for 3 years. Okay, and out of these 3 years, for the first year India is taking the chairmanship, and next year someone else will take, then again after that someone else will take. Okay, WHO Executive Board composition. The Executive Board is composed of 34 individuals technically qualified in the field of health, each one designated by a member state elected to do so by the WHO, World Health Assembly. So remember that the person should be qualified in the field of health. Okay, that is again a requisite. Just being a minister is not the criteria for selection over here. The member states are elected for 3 years term, right? The chairmanship's post is held by rotation for 1 year amongst the regional groups. Okay, so this year India is the chairperson. It is not a full-time assignment, and the chairman is just required to chair the executive board's meeting, which occurs every 6 months. Okay, so the board meets at least twice a year. So the chairperson will be required to chair that meeting. What are the main functions? The main functions of executive board are to give effect to the decisions and policies of World Health Assembly, to advise it, and generally to facilitate its work. Okay, so important happening with terms of India. Okay, we are a member of the executive board as well as the chairperson of the executive board. See, chairing such international organizations, being a member of international organizations is an important part of our strategy to become a superpower. Okay, any country will try to aspire to lead the world organizations. Okay, the next point, it is with respect to the illicit supply of drugs. Okay, during the COVID-19 situation, it has become important because UN, the office of UN, has itself come out on a report with respect to this issue. So the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, okay, UNODC, released a report on synthetic drugs in East and Southeast Asia, the latest development and challenges. Okay, so in the view of this COVID-19 situation, this UN's body has come up with this particular report. So United Nations Office on Drug and Crime. This was established in 1997 and was named UNODC in 2002. Just a factual thing. Important thing, it acts as an office for drug control and crime prevention by combining the United Nations International Drug Control Program and the Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Division of the United Nations Office at Vienna. Okay, so remember which two things are combined under this UNODC. That is important. Okay, that could be a bit framed. Okay, combining the United Nations International Drug Control Program and Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Division of United Nations at Vienna. So UNODC publishes the World Drug Report. Again, a bit could be there. Okay, which of the following organizations publishes Drug Report? So here is the answer: UNODC. According to this report, the COVID-19 induced lockdowns and movement restrictions may lead to an initial statistical reduction in the drugs seizures, but without a real change in terms of supply. Okay, so interestingly, what are they saying is that due to the lockdown, imposition of lockdowns, the seizures of drugs might have reduced. Seizures means what? The police or the enforcement agencies catching of the drugs from the drug traffickers. Now that amount might have reduced, but that doesn't indicate that the smuggling of the drugs has reduced. Okay. Now why? Let's see. In other words, the COVID-19 is unlikely to have an effect on illicit drug supply. Okay, so even during COVID-19, the report says that it is very less likely that the drug supply has reduced. Now, why that is happening? That is happening because shifting of priorities. Rearrangement of government priorities and resources to tackle the pandemic could threaten the efforts to strengthen drug prevention and treatment programs. So, what is happening due to this pandemic? All the government forces, they are right now focused on combating the COVID-19 situation. Okay, so all the police force or all other enforcement agencies, they are also focused on this COVID-19 situation. So earlier, maybe if suppose 100 people were available to look after the cases of drug trafficking, right now only maybe 20 are available. 80 people have been diverted for the COVID-19 situation, and due to that also this reduction in the catching of the drugs trafficking material has been observed. That is what the report is saying. Then no direct correlation. Not every fluctuation in terms of drugs seizures, price, drug-related arrests or deaths in the coming months would be direct or indirect consequence of the outbreak. Okay, this is just a general thing. Quick and flexible response. Active organized crime groups have shown flexibility to respond to shortages of supplies and have raised the risk levels on certain trafficking routes. Okay, and an important. See, these drug cartels, they operate in a very organized way. So in spite of the challenges posed by the COVID-19 situations, okay, or in the view of the challenges faced by this COVID-19 situation, they have regrouped themselves, they have, changed their ways of operation, and they have not allowed that impact their supply of the drugs. That is what is happening. Local capacities, main synthetic drugs of concern in the region, that is methamphetamine, also called as meth, was manufactured, trafficked, and consumed without the need for globalized supply. Okay, so remember this name, methamphetamine. Okay, also called as meth. The report says that this majority of this drug is grown and consumed globally, locally only, so that global supply chains are not at all hampering its distribution or anything. Indian context. India reported a substantial increase in seizures of amphetamine type stimulants, okay, amphetamine stimulants, most of which are suspected to be meth. The reasons: growth in trafficking of meth from the Golden Triangle overland to Bangladesh with some routes crossing India. Yes, this is a classic case. We are India over here, whereas the Golden Triangle of this drug trafficking is on our eastern side, and the Golden Crescent of this drugs is on our western side. We are caught in between. Okay, I will show you the drawing. The Golden Triangle represents the region coinciding with the rural mountains of Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand. Okay, so these countries, they form the Golden Triangle, which lies to the east of India. Also, Vietnam to some extent. It is Southeast Asia's main opium producing region and one of the oldest narcotics supply route to Europe and North America. Okay, so oldest producing as well as supplying to the entire world. It's not that they are consuming everything domestically. The use of maritime trafficking routes from Myanmar along the Andaman Sea, some of which crosses Indian territorial waters. Okay, so whatever this trafficking is done, uh, quite a few of that is done through the land of India, okay, as well as through the water of India. India is in the middle of two major illicit opium production regions in the world, the Golden Crescent in the west and the Golden Triangle in the east. As I told you, the Golden Crescent is the region of South Asia is a principal global site for opium production and distribution, comprising of Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan. Okay, I will show you the figure which will make this clear. See over here, this is India located, and this is the Golden Triangle over here on the eastern side of India. Okay, so this Golden Triangle, it consists of Burma, Thailand, and Laos. Okay, these are the major three countries, and also now Vietnam is also getting involved. Okay, and this is the Golden Crescent over here on the western side of India, comprising of Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, and India is lying in between them, right? Fine. Now let's talk something about the Amphan. Again, it has already hit the coast. This was made prior to that, so just go through it. Let's go through what I have made. So 3 lakh evacuated as Amphan hurtles towards Bengal coast. So the super cyclone Amphan, so actually it's pronounced Umphan, name given by Thailand, has weakened slightly and is expected to make a landfall between Digha in West Bengal and Hatia Islands in Bangladesh. It has already hit the coast right now, okay, as we are discussing this session. According to IMD's latest estimate, Umphan would temper down to a very severe cyclonic storm. Okay, that is what it was. And about 3.35 lakh people in West Bengal and Odisha have been evacuated due to this. The naming. The name Umphan, which is pronounced as Umphan, means sky. Remember this was given by Thailand in 2004. Okay. India, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Pakistan, Maldives, Oman, Sri Lanka, and Thailand decide the name of cyclones in the region. Okay, so whatever cyclones occur in the Bay of Bengal and this particular Arabian Sea and all these regions. So these are the countries: India, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Pakistan, Maldives, Oman, Sri Lanka, Thailand. Okay, who decide the names of these cyclones? The countries submit a list of cyclone names from time to time to choose the names from the pool. Okay, so they submit the names. So this name was submitted by Thailand way back in 2004 and it was chosen right now. While selecting names for cyclones, countries first analyze them to see if the word is easily understood by the people in the region. Hence, the names are generally familiar words. The strength of cyclones, okay, important. Remember this. The cyclones are classified based on wind speed and around the low pressure area. So wind speed of over 65 kilometers per hour is classified as a tropical cyclone and then it is assigned a name. So any wind speed below 62 kilometers per hour, it won't be called as a cyclone. Okay, it will be treated as a normal storm. It becomes a severe cyclonic storm if the speed exceeds 89 kilometers per hour and reaches up to 118 kilometers per hour. Okay, then it becomes a very severe cyclonic storm if the speed goes between 119 to 221 kilometers per hour. Okay, and those with higher speeds than 119 higher speeds than 221 kilometers per hour, okay, those will be categorized as super cyclonic storms. Okay, so just a categorization, remember this. Now why East Coast? Why is that we find more cyclones are appearing on the eastern coast there, as compared with the western coast of India? So more cyclones are formed in the Bay of Bengal than at the Arabian Sea due to the wind patterns that keep the oceans cooler on the western sides. Okay, so comparatively, the western side of the Indian Ocean, that is your Arabian Sea and the remaining portion below it, it is comparatively cooler than the eastern side, that is the Bay of Bengal and the portion below it. Okay, even among those found along the western coast, many move towards Oman instead of hitting Indian shores. Yes, if you see the Indian Ocean and if you see the way winds blow, many of them tend to move towards the cyclones, they generally tend to move towards the western side because they are caught in the trade winds, and hence many of them move towards Africa, right? Oman and all other countries over there. Okay, so storm forms on the eastern coast, right? However, are more intense, and since states on the side have relatively flatter topography compared to the western coasts, they can't deflect the winds. Okay. Now see, sometimes even if the storm from the Arabian Sea arrives towards the western coast, you will see that the western coasts, I mean the interior region of India, away from western coasts is guided by the Sahyadris. So even if a cyclone hits, it is going to damage just a smaller area. Okay. And if you go to the eastern coasts, it's comparatively flatter, and due to that flatness of the coast, that particular storm could devastate comparatively more area on the eastern coast. Okay, so first point to be noted is that number of cyclones that formed in the Bay of Bengal, they are more. Second, whatever cyclones they are formed, they are having more strength due to higher temperatures in the Bay of Bengal. Third, due to the movement of the trade winds, it's very likely that whatever cyclones are formed in the Bay of Bengal, they move towards India. And fourth point, due to the flatter topography on the of the eastern coast, they are likely to have major impact on the eastern coastal region. The hotter ocean spawns super cyclones. Meteorologists and atmospheric science experts state that higher than normal temperatures in the Bay of Bengal may be wetting super cyclones and the lockdown indirectly may have played a role. Okay, so now this is a new finding which has come forward. Overall, Bay of Bengal is having higher temperatures, okay, due to some geographical regions. But right now, due to this lockdown in past 2 to 3 months, that has also played an important role in increasing the temperature of Bay of Bengal to some extent. Now, how? Let's see what is the claim of the researchers. Another researcher said that elevated ocean temperature this year could, in part, be explained by the lockdown. Reduced particular matter emissions during the lockdown meant fewer aerosols such as black carbon that are known to deflect the sunlight and heat away from the surface. So, what these researchers are saying that during normal activity, when the industries are on, a lot of aerosols are released into the atmosphere, a lot of black carbon is released. Now we all know that this black carbon which is suspended in the air, that is going to absorb heat. So that black carbon, when it is absorbing heat, that also means that it is preventing that heat from reaching the oceans below, right? So now since that black carbon layer is not there, because the emissions have stopped, because the industries have stopped, whatever heat is coming, the sun rays are directly heating the water in the oceans, and due to that also the temperature has increased to some extent. Okay, that is what some researchers say. Cyclones gain their energy from the heat and moisture generated from warm ocean surfaces. A basic part of your geography, you all are aware of that. This year, the Bay of Bengal has posted record summer temperatures, a fallout as the researchers have warned of global warming from fossil fuel emissions that have been heating up the oceans. Okay, so this is general trend. Plus, added to that, the present year's increase due to the lack of the carbon suspended in the atmosphere. It is said that warming around India is no longer restricted to just Bay of Bengal, but also the Arabian Sea and Indian Ocean. Yes, not only India. Why only India? The entire world is now undergoing a increase of the temperature. Fine. So next point of discussion with respect to the malware threat. The Central Bureau of Investigation has sent alerts to all the states, union territories, and central agencies on a malicious software threat that uses an update related to COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, the alert related to banking Trojan Cerberus. So remember this name, Trojan Cerberus, has been sent on the basis of inputs received from Interpol. Okay, so CBI has sent this alert on the basis of inputs from Interpol with respect to Trojan Cerberus. What is this Trojan Cerberus? It's a malicious software threat, okay, which uses this update related to COVID-19 pandemic as a mask, right? It uses it as a mask, and it gathers the information of the users, which it may misuse on a later on date. Its primary use is to steal financial data such as credit card numbers. Alerts have been sent informing that this malicious software takes advantage of the COVID-19 pandemic to impersonate and send SMS using the lure of COVID-19 related content to download the embedded malicious link. It deploys its malicious applications, usually spread via phishing campaigns, to trick users into installing it into their smartphones. Okay, the Trojan can also use overlay attacks to trick victims into providing personal information and capture two-factor authentication details. Okay, so basically they are trying to gain all of your financial data, and obviously why? Because they want to steal from you. Okay, so remember this from the point of view of UPSC also, and also remember this from the point of view of your personal safety also. Okay, fine. The next point, Israel and Iran take their battle online. Okay, now this dispute between Israel and Iran is also escalating, and right now something with respect to cyber attacks took place. So you should be aware of that. According to high-ranking intelligence officials and experts in West Asia, Israel was behind the cyber attack that disrupted operations in a major port in Iran. Okay, so Israel was it. The attack on the computer systems at Shahid Rajai port. Okay, remember the name of the port, see the location of the port, see the location of Iran, see the location of Israel, see whether Iran and Israel share a border. Do they share? No, they don't share, but just see all that geographical locations. Okay, in the strategically important state of Hormuz was limited in scope, creating traffic jams of delivery trucks and some delays in shipments, but causing no substantial or lasting damage. So Israel carried out this particular attack, okay, on this Shahid Rajah port of Iran, located in Strait of Hormuz. Now again, the Israel didn't meant any threat actually, but they just wanted to showcase their superior cyber security or cyber intelligence to Iran, because earlier Iran had tried to hack one of their systems. Okay, so it was a message sent by Israel to Iran by carrying out this particular attack. That is what the international analysis say. So Israel and Iran have recently been engaged in exchange of attempted and successful cyber attacks, and the purpose of Israel's relatively small-scale effort at the port, according to intelligence officials, was to send a message to Tehran to not target Israeli infrastructure. Okay, the hacking of ports' computers came in direct response to a failed Iranian cyber attack on an Israeli water facility. So earlier, Iran had attacked on the Israeli water facility and it failed, and then Israel has done this attack on their facility at the Shahid Rajai port. The incident that promoted the Israel attack on the port happened when a pump at a municipal water system in Sharon region of central Israel stopped working. The facility's computer system resumed pump operation in a short time, but also recorded the occurrence as exceptional event. Okay, that's fine. So need not remember this. This is just I have taken from the news article, but need not remember this. Okay, remember this particular portion. Steps to boost ease of doing business. Okay, another new thing with respect to whatever COVID-19 situation is occurring in India. What are the new steps? What are the few remedial measures that the government is taking? So Government of India has decided to bring various amendments to Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code (IBC) and the Companies Act 2013 to enhance ease of doing business in the country. Okay, we already know this is a part of your static syllabus. What are these two? Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code and Companies Act. The amendments to these laws are a part of government's economic stimulus package announced under Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan. Okay, so these amendments are done under this umbrella scheme of Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan. Remember that also. India was placed 63rd position in the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business report 2020 out of 190 countries. This also we already know, we have seen it in one of our MCQs, right? Changes in the insolvency and bankruptcy code. Now, what are the changes? Let's see them. Minimum threshold to initiate insolvency proceedings has been raised to 1 crore from 1 lakh, which largely insulates micro, small, and medium enterprises. Okay, so what is insolvency? Insolvency means if a particular organization, company has gone bankrupt, the assets of that organization would be seized and then they would be either sold or liquidated, and that particular loan would be recovered, right? Now this was done in order to enable banks and other financial institutions to do their recovery in a proper way. But right now, due to COVID-19 situation, it's very well estimated that many industries are going to face losses. So due to the losses which are occurring due to reasons which are beyond the control of the companies, if insolvency and bankruptcy code is applied and their assets are seized, it would be an injustice against them and it will kill the economy. So these amendments have been made. So the first thing, this bar has been raised from 1 lakh to 1 crore. So many of the small, medium, micro enterprises, they will be saved from this particular seizure of assets. Suspension of fresh initiation of insolvency proceedings for 1 year, depending upon the pandemic. That means for 1 year, from May 2020 onwards, no insolvency proceedings will be started against any of the company, whether a micro, small, medium, or even large. Okay, and again, it could be further extended if unfortunately the pandemic also continues. Okay, hope that situation never arises. Empowering the central government to exclude COVID-19 related debt from a definition of default under the IBC for purpose of triggering insolvency proceedings. Okay, now this is important. If a particular company, it is found that it was functioning well before this COVID-19, everything is good, but just due to the impact of COVID-19, now the functioning of the company has stopped, and due to that, that company has become indebted, and due to that, uh, if that assets are required to be seized, then that won't be classified under the insolvency and bankruptcy codes, and those assets will not be seized. Okay, so care is taken that the hardness or hardship caused by COVID-19 does not create another hardship of economy. Decriminalization under the Companies Act 2013. Again, this is important. The move seeks to remove criminal penalties from all the provisions of the Companies Act except the provisions dealing with fraudulent conduct. Okay, so this was a demand of companies. I mean, many of the private sector entrepreneurs, right from the beginning, when this criminal provisions were inserted in the 2013 Companies Act. Okay, so they wanted to make it civil offense, and yes, government is doing it right now, except for only those provisions which are dealing with fraudulent conduct. Okay, fraudulent means by purpose the company is cheating someone. Now, in that case, obviously, it has to be a criminal offense. But if the business is failing genuinely, then certainly it need not be a criminal offense. It could be tried under civil offense. The decriminalized offenses include administrative offenses such as delays in filing in corporate social responsibility or failure to rectify the register of members in compliance with orders from the National Company Law Tribunal. So simple things, okay, whatever filings that are to be done. So earlier, even if this company had failed on these grounds, it could be counted as a criminal offense. Now it would be counted. A number of offences under the Act previously classified as compoundable offences will not have imprisonment penalty now. Compoundable offences are those offences that have either imprisonment or fines as punishments. Okay, so right now this will be removed. No compoundable offences will be there. Some of the offences under the Act have been omitted altogether, while others have been shifted from the purview of NCLT to an in-house adjudication mechanism. Okay, now what is this in-house adjudication mechanism? Under this mechanism, the matter will be dealt by Registrar of Companies, okay, ROC. So the ROC, it is a body of your Ministry of Corporate Affairs, which is responsible for registering any new company that is formed in India, and as well as the companies have to submit their annual reports and periodic reports to the Registrar of the Companies. So it is a regulating authority of Government of India under the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. So whatever this adjudication is to be done, that is also now handed over to the Registrar of Companies. Okay. So ROC is now empowered to decide penalties for the offences under the Act. Now that is more logical also, because ROC is having much more know-how about the operation of the company, because they get a periodic report from the company. So they have a well documented data with respect to the company's operations of the companies, the problems faced by the companies. So logically, they would be a much better competent authority to deal with the default also done by the companies. Changes to raise the funds for companies. There's right now money, cash or liquidity has become a major concern. Now some changes have also been made in order to enable the companies to raise more funds. Now what are those changes? First, direct listing of securities by Indian public companies in permissible foreign jurisdictions. Okay, so any Indian company, okay, if allowed at the foreign country, they can directly go and list over there, okay, on the share markets over there. So obviously, if the shares are traded over there, they can have lot of money flowing from there. The private companies which just want to list the non-convertible debentures on stock exchanges not to be regarded as listed companies. Okay. Now there is a procedure to become a listed company on any of the stock exchange. So this procedure many times it creates a hurdle for the companies to get listed on the stock exchanges, right? Now on the stock exchanges, different things are traded, shares are traded, bonds are traded, debentures are traded, etc., etc. So what this change they have brought in, particularly with respect to the non-convertible debentures, if a company wants to trade them on stock exchanges, then the company need not list itself, they can directly trade. Earlier listing of company was compulsory to trade the non-convertible debentures. Now it is not required. Okay. Now what are debentures? Debentures are nothing but debentures are say something like a fixed deposit. Okay, so you have a fixed deposit in a bank of say 5 years. The bank gives you back your money after 5 years with the rate, a fixed rate of interest which the bank had committed. So debentures are something of that sort only. Okay, so debentures are something like FDs with the company. So company will give you back your money after the committed period of time with the committed interest rate. Now again, there are two types of debentures, something called as non-convertible and something called as convertible. Now understand that. Now there is also something called as share. Now what is the main difference between share and a debenture? Share means the person who is holding the share is a owner of that company in the extent of the percentage of the shares. Okay, so however small that ownership might be in percentage wise, but that person is the owner of the company. Whereas in debentures, the person is the creditor of the company. The person has given money to the company on say some interest rate, so he is the creditor of the company. Okay, so now there are convertible debentures. So when convertible debentures are there, then that person has got flexibility to change those debentures into shares whenever he or she wants. Okay, so your debentures can be changed into shares. Such type of debentures are called as convertible debentures. And then there are another type of debentures, okay, which cannot be converted to shares. You purchase them and they will remain with you till the maturity date. Such type of debentures which cannot be converted into shares, they are called as non-convertible debentures. Okay, that was basic. Fine. This will bring additional sources of funding to the companies who do not wish to comply with the regulations applicable to listed companies. Yes, as I said, listing requires a lot of compliances, lot of time, lot of paperwork. So this change has allowed the companies to bypass this paperwork, bypass the time that is required, and directly list their non-convertible debentures on the trading platforms. Okay. Now, next point with respect to Odisha adopting contract farming system. The Odisha government has promulgated an ordinance allowing investors and farmers to enter into an agreement for contract farming in view of continuing uncertainties due to pandemic. Okay, so remember, Odisha government has recently done this. The ordinance is aimed at facilitating both farmers and sponsors to develop mutually beneficial and efficient contract farming systems. Yes, obviously, it is argued that the new system will improve production and marketing of agricultural produce and livestock while promoting farmers' interests. The state, however, has made it clear that, okay, now remember this is very important. Why? See, farmers, they are very good at their growing crops or whatever things are done to do with respect to getting more yield from the crops. But when it comes to marketing or when it comes to other infrastructure like storage, okay, they don't have the capital. Now due to this, farmers are in distress, as well as the consumers, they don't get the quality product at the price at which the farmer is selling, and the middlemen, they earn a lot of money. Now by contract farming, what is happening, big companies could directly have a contract with the farmers, they could directly take their particular crop, so the farmers could earn good money. Okay, so something like say in states like Maharashtra, Gujarat, we already have this contract farming. So you will have big companies like your PepsiCo and all those things, they have contract farming with say potato growers. Take an example in Maharashtra. If you come to Maharashtra, in Pune district, if you see the region of this Junnar taluka, Khed taluka, etc., majority of the farmers over there have contract farming with this PepsiCo company, okay, which manufactures your Lays, potato Lays, which you eat. Now these companies, they give all the inputs to the farmers. They give them the seeds, they give them the fertilizers, they give them the pesticides, they also train them, and also they give them whatever other things are required to have a good crop. Plus there is an assurance that when the crop comes, we will purchase your potatoes at a particular fixed rate which they might have committed. And again, there is an obligation on the farmers that they should not use this crop and grow potatoes and sell them to someone else. So there, it's binding on both the parties. But the farmer's point of view is that he gets an assured income from such things. So that is what Odisha is also trying to do right now. Contract farming involves agricultural production being carried out on the basis of an agreement between the buyer and the farmer producer. Okay, so whoever is the buyer, he will have an prior agreement with the farmer, that is a producer. Sometimes it involves buyers specifying the quality required and the price with the farmer agreeing to deliver at the future date. Yes, sometimes and many times this happens actually. Obviously, who is buying, if they are assuring a particular price to that particular crop, they are going to verify the quality also. No doubt about that. Contract farming is allowed in most states like Gujarat, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Haryana, Uttarakhand, Madhya Pradesh, and West Bengal under the amended APMC Act, and companies and agencies have to seek permission or license in each state separately. Okay, remember this also, because agriculture is a state subject, so you can't have a blanket permission for entire India. You have to go to every state government. Advantages of contract farming. Now see, this could be a very useful article for your mains write up also. Okay, there could be a question in mains also. It will help increase income for farmers, particularly small and marginal ones, as they will get better access to good quality inputs and better farm practices. Obviously, as I said, the companies themselves provides them all the inputs, seeds, fertilizers, equipments, etc., plus training also, so they are going to benefit. A deeper engagement between farmers and food processors or retailers helps in guiding the farmers align the crop varieties, quality, farm management practices, etc. with what market wants. Yes, very much important, right? Instead of just going for traditionally sowing year after year what their fathers and forefathers were sowing, if the farmers shift their cultivation to those plants which are in demand in the market, then they will be certainly gaining more profits. And when will they come to know about what is more in demand? If they are having direct contacts with the supply chains in the market. So this contract farming is again establishing that. It will reduce the marketing risk for the farmers due to pre-agreed prices and market assurance. Yes, already the price has been agreed, so nothing to worry about the marketing. The government should focus on providing a successful model for farmers through well-defined legal provisions for contract farming. Okay, now this is important. We still don't have specific legal provisions with respect to contract farming. Whatever provisions are there, the general provisions of a contract which apply to any contract in India, those are applicable right now. But since agriculture is something very much specialized, we should have some specialized provisions. Okay, if that is done, that is better. The farmer should ensure the security of the growers, which requires the buyers and the farmers to sign long-term contracts so productivity and crop quality are maintained through proper investments. Okay, that's fine. Monopsony has to be avoided in contract farming since one company entering into agreement with large number of farmers puts the growers at disadvantage. Now again important, monopsony. What is monopsony? Okay, many times or till now, many times you must have heard something called as monopoly. Now what is monopoly? Monopoly means monopoly. Okay, this word all of you are aware of. Monopoly means there is only one supplier in the market. Okay, there is one producer in the market. Okay, there is only one company which is manufacturing a particular thing. That is monopoly. Okay, so the supplier side uh, creating or the supplier side restricted to just one supplier is monopoly. And what is monopsony? Monopsony means there is only one buyer in the market. Okay, only one buyer in the market. So whatever anyone produces, you have to go and sell it to just one person or one organization only. Okay, now this is also harmful. The way monopoly is harmful, similarly monopsony is also harmful, because if there is no alternative buyer, then again the producer will be required to sell the produce at the cost which the one particular person who is doing the monopsony is demanding it for. So both the things are dangerous. Monopoly is also dangerous, monopsony is also dangerous. Okay. Now next, with respect to Western Ghats, ecological sensitive areas in Western Ghats. Recently, the Union Minister of Environment, Forest and Climate Change interacted with the chief ministers of six states, okay, through which Western Ghats go, through a video conferencing to discuss issues related to the notification of ecologically sensitive zones or ecologically sensitive areas pertaining to the Western Ghats. Now, which are the 6 states? So, starting from south, if you say it's Kerala, it's also Tamil Nadu, it's gone over here. Okay, fine. Then Karnataka, Goa, Maharashtra, and Gujarat. Yes, Gujarat also, the southern tip of Gujarat, it also comprises of a small portion of your Western Ghats. So background, the government had constituted a high-level working group under the chairmanship of Dr. Kasturi Rangan, remember, important name, to conserve and protect the biodiversity of Western Ghats while allowing for sustainable and inclusive development of the region. Okay, so this is recent. Earlier we had a Gadgil committee. Okay, see here I have mentioned it. Now what had happened is actually the Gadgil committee had given very stringent norms. Almost more than 60% of the area of Western Ghats, they had said that it should be classified as ecological sensitive, and they had recommended such stringent norms that they said that not even a leaf should be plucked from a tree which is falling in the ecological sensitive zone. So they were very stringent norms. Now, government, yes, does want to conserve the Western Ghats, but remember in the Western Ghats also there are many villages, there are many people who have lived over there for centuries together. Now, what about the development of those people, right? Should the development of those people be compromised in the name of ecological sensitivity? So, government again appointed a committee. Then this is the Kasturi Rangan committee, and the committee was asked to come out with such provisions which will have a balance of taking care of the ecological sensitivity also and the basic development that might be required in that particular region. Okay, so that is the brief. The committee had recommended and identified geographical areas falling in 6 states of Kerala, Karnataka, Goa, Maharashtra, Gujarat, and Tamil Nadu may be declared as ecological sensitive areas. The committee recommended to just bring 37% of Western Ghats under ecological sensitive zones, down from 64% which were suggested by Gadgil committee report. Okay, so as I said, the norms were quite stringent in the Gadgil committee report. Okay, and mind well, he's a great environmentalist. I have met him. He lives in Pune itself. I have had a brief discussion with him for about 3 to 4 hours. That was way back in 2009. Okay, when I was preparing for my UPSC interview. Environment is very dear to him. The Western Ghats Ecology Expert Panel, also known as the Gadgil Committee, was an environmental research commission appointed by the government in 2011. Okay, fine. A draft notification related to the same was issued in 2018, mentioning the areas to be notified in the ecological sensitive areas. All the involved states recognized a need to protect the Western Ghats. However, the states expressed their concerns related to allowed activities and extent of area mentioned in the draft notification. Okay, as I said, yes, they are concerned about the ecological sensitivity areas, no doubt about that, but the development of the indigenous people over there, that is also important. Further, it has also been decided that state-specific issues will be discussed and resolved through consensus. Okay, so it's still ongoing. It has not been accepted 100%, but no, we are expecting it to be accepted sooner. Then something with respect to open skies treaties. So this treaty is basically between US, Russia, and other few countries. Some 34 countries are there. Okay, so now again, you might have seen that USA is taking a very conservative approach in terms of everything in past few years, 2 to 3 years. And again, this open skies treaties, in that also USA is again taking some conservative approach. It's trying to pull back from this treaty also. The United States of America has announced that it will exit the Open Skies Treaty due to continuous violation of the treaty by Russia and changes in the security environment. Okay, so US has threatened to go out of it. Okay, it's exiting actually. It is expected to formally pull out of Open Six Skies in 6 months. What is USA stance? The USA has blamed Russia for restricting US flyovers in the neighboring Georgia and its military enclave in Kaliningrad, Russia. Okay, need not remember these names. Just remember that US has blamed Russia and it is pulling out of this Open Skies Treaty. Russia alleging that Russia has misused its flights over US and Europe to identify critical infrastructure for potential attacks in wartime. Okay, so let's see what Russia's stand is there. Russia has denied the allegations and warned that withdrawal will affect the interest of all the 35 participating countries in this open skies treaty. However, Russia intended to fully follow all the rights and obligations under the treaty as long as the treaty is in force. It can be noted that USA has used the treaty more intensively than Russia. Okay, so in fact, USA has used it more intensively than Russia, but still USA is alleging that Russia is misusing it. Now, what is this Open Skies Treaty? See, this Open Skies Treaty, it allows the member countries, whatever these 35 participating countries are there, the member countries to fly any unmanned, okay, unmanned aeroplane over the other country, okay, in order to do a surveillance with respect to whether they are not building anything with related to war. Okay, so sky is opened for unmanned aerial vehicle to do surveillance to ensure that there is nothing happening in that region which is now going to support war in future. This was the open skies treaty. Okay, and Russia, what is Russia alleging right now? Sorry, US alleging right now that Russia had used this to identify targets in USA which Russia could hit if at all USA and Russia go to war. Okay, now all of this is a perception fight. Open Science Treaty, it was signed in 1992, came into effect in 2002. It's an agreement that allows its 35 actually signatory countries to monitor arms development by conducting surveillance flights unarmed over each other's territories. Okay, so you can have surveillance flights over other territories, right? And monitor whether any arms development thing is going on over there or not. Therefore, the treaty established an aerial surveillance system for its participants. Both USA and Russia are the signatories of the treaty. Remember, India is not a member of this treaty. Okay, so we don't allow any particular foreign aircraft just to fly over India and do surveillance over India. That is not happening in India. Okay, fine. Then another treaty. Now, since this particular Open Skies Treaty was in news, another two, three treaties again. Let's see them, which were also in news. So, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Okay, this I think we had discussed in some session a month back also. It was a nuclear arms control accord reached by US and the Soviet Union in 1987, in which the two nations agreed to eliminate their stocks of intermediate range and short range missiles, okay, which are land based and which could carry nuclear warheads. So they wanted to cut down the numbers of these particular missiles, okay, which are land based missiles, both US and USSR. It also covered all the land-based missiles, including those carrying nuclear warheads, but did not cover the sea-launched missiles. Right? The United States withdrew from this treaty again on 22nd of August 2019. So this treaty also USA has withdrawn. As I said, USA is really following a bit of conservative approach since past 3-4 years. Okay. Now this treaty was just between the USA and Russia. Now if one country out of the two has withdrawn, obviously the treaty is no longer having any meaning. Okay, this particular intermediate range nuclear forces treaty. Then there was also something called as New START treaty. Now what is this? The New Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, that is START, is a treaty between again USA and Russian Federation on measures for further reduction and limitation of strategic offensive arms. Now, see, Russia and USA, why are we discussing all these treaties of Russia and USA? Remember that these two are major military powers in the world. They have major capabilities in terms of manufacturing of military equipments. Okay, though economically Russia might be shattered right now, but militarily still it is very, very powerful. And obviously, USA is still very much is powerful in all terms. It's militarily, economically, as well as politically. Okay, so anything that happens between Russia and USA, it is going to have an impact on the world, or the world should observe closely what is happening so as to be on the safer side. So this, it is START treaty, New START treaty. It is a successor to the START framework of 1991 that limited both sides to 1600 strategic delivery vehicles and 6000 warheads. Okay, so this was the earlier treaty. The USA has been worried that extending the New START would negatively impact an arms deal with China and Russia. So again, a conservative approach of USA over here. It is concerned that China's nuclear stockpile could be doubled if New START treaty continued as it without including China. So what is the START treaty? It is restricting the number of nuclear heads between Russia and USA. But then what about China, which is emerging as a major global power? That China is not a signatory to START. So even if Russia and China, USA are controlling their nuclear stockpiles, China is not. Now, that is a worrying factor for USA. The new START treaty also suffered from verification inadequacies, and that US intended to establish a new arms control regime which would include China. Okay, so they want China to be a member of that. Fine. Now, next point of discussion. With respect to the locust, you must have seen those videos which have emerged in Punjab, Haryana, etc. The swarms of locust flooding the fields over there. Even they have reached Gujarat, Rajasthan, even Maharashtra, right? Vidarbha, Marathwada regions of Maharashtra have also been invaded. Started from Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and now in India. The locust invasion in South and Southwest Asia. India has reached out to Pakistan to counter a locust invasion which threatens to destroy crops and undermine food security in South and Southwest Asia. India has proposed a trilateral response in partnership with Pakistan and Iran. So remember, so we want to have a trilateral response in which India, Pakistan, and Iran will be involved to combat this desert locust wave sweeping across Afro-Asian regions. Okay. India's proposals. The countries could coordinate locust control operations along the border, and India can facilitate the supply of malathion, the pesticide used to kill this locust. So remember the name of this pesticide, it's malathion, which is used to kill this locust. So what India is saying that we will supply this malathion to you, Pakistan and Iran, and you try and kill those locusts near your borders themselves. So automatically, if they are killed at the borders themselves, they are not going to reach India also. India is proposing the revival of locust warning organization to coordinate a robust joint response by India, Pakistan, and Iran. Okay. Responses. Iran has welcomed India's offer. It will help Iran control desert locusts in its arid South Khorasan province and the Sistan Balochistan province that borders Pakistan. Pakistan is yet to reply. Yes, that's obvious. Okay, fine. Then something with respect to digital currency in China. Okay, so recently China has launched this digital currency, right? Digital currency electronic payment, DCEP. Now, just to give you a brief idea of this, you must have heard something about Bitcoin. Okay, now this word Bitcoin is making a lot of news since past 4 or 5 years. Okay, so what is this Bitcoin? So just to tell you in layman's language, this Bitcoin is nothing but some sort of electronic currency. Okay, which is not backed by any country. Obviously, it has got no legal backing of any country. It is created by private entrepreneurs themselves, and it is used to trade goods. So it's a form of electronic currency. Now, what has happened is this Bitcoin has really changed the way the entire world is looking at currencies. Okay, different countries in the world tried to control this Bitcoin thing earlier. Right, cryptocurrency. There are many cryptocurrencies. Basically, the correct term is cryptocurrency, or the broader term is cryptocurrency. One of the cryptocurrency is Bitcoin, but Bitcoin had become more famous because it spread a lot. Okay, there are many others also. Now what happened is these currencies, they are almost challenging the legally established currencies of the nations. People are shifting to using these Bitcoins and other cryptocurrencies more. Many countries try to curb their use initially, but later on they realize that this is much better way of using the currency. This is perhaps more advanced way of a currency. Okay, and perhaps China is the first country who has realized this much more better than other countries. And now China, instead of opposing this Bitcoin, they themselves have come up with their own cryptocurrency, which is digital currency electronic payment. So something like, if you can't defeat someone, you become the one amongst them, or you use their technology. That's it. Okay, and it has got many advantages. That's why they are using it. So perhaps we are seeing a transition of the currency, or major transition could be seen in another 10-15 years. Okay, so something like earlier we had currencies made up of gold, then we had of silver because gold was expensive, then we had of iron, copper, etc., then we had of stones, then we have of paper, right? Now we are moving towards electronic currency, maybe. So People's Bank of China, PBOC, China's central bank has initiated the central bank digital currency. Okay, it is christened as digital currency electronic payment, which is available via a mobile wallet app. What is this DPECP? It is designed to function as a cash or just as the base money supply. Okay, DCEP is built with blockchain and cryptography, which presumably ensures superb security. It is run on a centralized database. Okay, so blockchains, we all know that it's nothing but different blocks. Okay, a chain of blocks connected together. Okay, and what are these blocks made up of? These blocks are made up of digital data. Okay, they will be having digital data, right? So DCEP uses a DLT architecture with central controls, which preserves the primacy of the monetary authority, unlike private cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin that are truly decentralized. So now, what is the main difference between Bitcoin and this digital currency electronic payment of China? It is that this Bitcoin is totally owned, operated by private entrepreneurs. So something like it's decentralized. No government is having any control over it. But this DCEP, it will be a centrally controlled by government of China. That is the main difference. The plan is part of response to President Xi Jinping's push to seize the opportunity of blockchain technology. Now, the digital yuan is structured on two-tier monetary system. Okay, how is the two-tier monetary system? First, a central bank issued CBDC for commercial banks. Okay, and second, a commercial bank issued CBDC focused on public. So obviously, the way we have in India, RBI to the commercial banks, then commercial banks to the public. This is first such serious initiative in the whole world, as I discussed earlier. So first time really any government is getting involved into this cryptocurrency type of thing in such seriousness, right? Why China developed it? Chinese investors were always enamored means attracted, okay, attracted towards something, enamored of cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin became increasingly popular as an alternative asset in China. China has emerged as the capital of crypto ecosystem, accounting for almost 90% of trading volumes and hosting two-thirds of Bitcoin mining operations. So see, instead of going for the trading in yuan, the official currency, people in China, majority of them started trading in Bitcoins, right, and other cryptocurrencies. And in spite of major efforts by Chinese government was not in a position to control them. The PBOC tried hard to curtail this exuberance but achieved limited success. This move to introduce CBDC in China is a logical outcome of the efforts to curb and tackle its runaway crypto market practices. Or the philosophy of People's Bank of China could simply have been, if you cannot beat them, join them. So simple. People are finding this use of cryptocurrencies much more easier and much more valuable. Then instead of bringing a ban on them, what China is doing is they themselves have coming up with an official cryptocurrency. Now that the Chinese people are having an option or alternative of using the official cryptocurrency, which will give them all the advantages which are given by these private cryptocurrencies. Plus, it will have the legitimacy of the government. So obviously, it is expected that they will shift to this legitimate cryptocurrency created by government of China. Signals from the move. First on the world economic stage, it may want DCEP to challenge the hegemony of US dollars as the default global reserve currency. Yes, obviously, China is certainly not going to restrict the use of this to their own country. They're trying to take the advantage of this electronic currency world over. And see, already Bitcoins and other cryptocurrencies have shown their utility to different countries, the people in different current countries. So China is certainly going to take the advantage of this. Second, in its war with America's big tech, it may want to showcase DCEP as its weapon of choice to counter Facebook's Libra. Yes, Facebook is also coming up with this new currency. Again, this is a cryptocurrency only, Libra, which is planning to offer common cryptocurrency to 2 billion plus Facebook users across the world. Now, see, as I said at the beginning of this topic, perhaps we are going to see a major change in the way currencies will be exchanged in future. In this could be a major phase of change. Okay, from say your rupee, dollar, pound sterling, etc., to some cryptocurrencies. Okay. Third, and still in the realm of speculation, it may wish to use the DCEP to clip the wings of Alipay and WeChat Pay. Now Alipay, it's Alibaba, and WeChat Pay, okay, again over there in China, these companies are operating gigantic fintech duopolies that control 90% of China's domestic digital payments and whose ambitions may one day pose a threat to the aura and authority of central bank. So see, these Alipay and WeChat Pay, something like Paytm or other payment systems we have, right? We have is what we have. We have Paytm is there in India, and what else is there? Mobile Pay is there, right? So similarly, this Alipay and WeChat Pay are the private sector payment gateways in China, and 90% of the digital payments are done through this. So Chinese government is also seeing these transactions as a threat to the central bank, and perhaps if they bring this DCEP, that is the digital cryptocurrency of the government of China, again this position of Alipay and WeChat Pay could be shaken, and the control again could be vested in the central bank of China. From gold to silver to paper to digital, the march of currencies goes on. Okay, so we are still evolving, right? Now recently towards digital currency. China has rolled the dice on central bank digital currencies, challenging other nations to follow. Yes, as I said, China is the pioneer. First time any government or a central bank coming up or accepting cryptocurrency as a norm and coming up with their own currency, cryptocurrency. Now, if China, which is such a big economic leader in the world, is doing this, perhaps many will follow suit. Okay. Now, something with respect to COVID-19. Okay. Uh, Not that much important, maybe from your exam point of view, but important as a news. So I just took this. 80% success chance for Oxford trials. Only one or two bits in this are important. The Serum Institute of India is the world's largest manufacturer of vaccines by volume. Now, this is an important bit for your prelims. Okay, Serum Institute of India, located in Pune. Okay, where I live right now in Magarpatta city, it is just hardly 3 kilometers from here. Okay, Serum Institute. India quietly plays a key role in manufacturing 60 to 70% of all vaccines sold globally, with the Serum Institute playing a leading role. Again, an important bit, right? The Serum Institute of India is working on several candidate vaccines while collaborating with other organizations as well as developing its own. A potential vaccine is the experimental vaccine developed by a team at University of Oxford and now licensed to drug maker AstraZeneca, with whom Serum is in talks to mass produce the vaccine, which is now in clinical trial stage. So still in clinical trial stage, not yet 100% successful. The vaccine was initially known as CHADOX1 and now is known as AZD12222. Okay, fine. So if at all it becomes successful, then you need to remember these names. It's just 80% successful now, not yet 100% successful. So right now, even if you don't remember this, it's fine. The ongoing trials had 80% chance of success given the vaccine is based on tried and tested platforms. Okay, remember these 2 points. These are very much important, right, with respect to Serum Institute. Now RBI has again cut the repo rate by 4% down to 4%, right? Cut to 4%, not by 4%. It has been cut by 40 basic points. Okay, and now it is standing at 4%. We all know what is repo rate. Repo rate is nothing but the rate at which RBI lends to the commercial banks. The Reserve Bank of India (RBI) has reduced the key interest rate or the repo rate, the interest rate that the RBI charges for funds given to the banks, by 40 basis points to stabilize the financial systems. Okay, so what is expected that the bank should pass on this reduction of interest rate to their consumers. Okay, fine. Cumulatively, since the imposition of national lockdown in March 2020, the MPC has cut the rates by 115 basis points. The repo rate now stands at 4%, so quite low. Why did RBI cut the interest rates? Now, obviously, it's a monetary tool which tries to control the amount of money, quantity of money in the markets. So, obviously, by reducing this repo rates, RBI is trying to push in more liquidity into the markets, right? The Monetary Policy Committee (MPC) was of the view that macroeconomics impact of the pandemic is turning out to be more severe than initially anticipated, and various sectors of economy are experiencing acute stress. Yes, very much. Okay, we didn't, when we started with the first lockdown, we didn't expect that no, we will have another second, third, fourth lockdown. And today, on 28th of March, May, we are perhaps no, I mean, when the lockdown is going to end on 31st of May, perhaps we could find another fifth lockdown coming in at least certain parts of India. Okay, the impact now. Who would have wondered this in the beginning of March? No one. The impact of the shock has been compounded by the interaction of supply disruptions and demand compressions. Yes, both the things have happened, right? Demand has also reduced because now people are buying just the essential things, right? All other non-essential things demand has reduced. Plus, there is supply disruptions also, because somewhere raw material is not available, somewhere labor is not available, somewhere some particular part is not available, and due to just non-availability of one part, the entire unit of that particular product can't be manufactured. Okay, plus supply, whatever the logistics management was there, that was also been disrupted due to lack of labor, lack of proper operating systems, people to man different gateway points in the supply chain system. Beyond the destruction of economic and financial activity, livelihood and health has also severely affected. Yes, we have seen that every one of us is experiencing that. Even as various measures initiated by the government and RBI work to mitigate an adverse impact of the pandemic on economy, this accommodative step is a necessity to revive growth and mitigate the impact of COVID-19. The decision was also considered keeping inflation within the target. Fine. Now, what are the other measures that RBI has taken? Let's see them. The central bank has extended the loan repayment moratorium for another 3 months till August 31. Okay, so earlier RBI had given this loan repayment moratorium for 3 months up till 31st of May. Now again they have extended it for another 3 months, June, July, August. So till 31st of August, even if you don't pay your loan, that is fine. The extension of the moratorium on the repayment of term loans by borrowers means that they would not have to pay the loan EMIs during the moratorium period. Okay, so your EMIs will be shifted beyond the 6 months. In addition, interest payment deferment for working capital loans has also been extended by another 6 months. Okay, so whatever working capital you have taken in which only interest is required to pay, again for that you may not pay the interest for 6 months. It will be recovered for additional 6 months later on. RBI has also decided to increase the group exposure limit of banks from 25 to 30% of its capital base. Now, this is important. What is group exposure? First, understand it. Group exposure limit determines the maximum amount a bank can lend to one business house. Okay. So earlier, this limit was 25%. Say, suppose a company is there, ABC. So whatever assets are there with the bank, maximum loan that a particular organization ABC can get from the bank is 25% of those assets of the bank, or 25% of the loans given by that bank. Now they have increased it up to 30%. Okay, so now ABC can get additional 5% more if the bank obviously is willing to give. All other conditions for facility remain unchanged. A loan will not be classified by lenders as non-performing, and there will not be any impact on individual credit scores. Okay, so even if default of payment is happening, why? Because moratorium has been extended. Then also the assets won't be classified as non-performing. Normally, asset is classified, or asset means loan is classified as non-performing asset if three continuous EMIs bounce. Okay, three continuous EMIs bounce. Now nothing of such sort is going to happen. Okay, fine. Monetary measures may have been taken to ease economic stress, but there are limitations to what it can achieve. It cannot do the heavy lifting alone. Fiscal support is needed. Okay, so that was an opinion which was given in that article of Hindu. Okay, another important thing with respect to leaks. Details of 2.9 crore job seekers are there available on the darknet. Data leak detected by cyber security firm Cybele. Okay, remember this name also, Cybele, Personal details of about 2.9 lakh crore Indian job seekers have been found dumped on the darknet, raising concerns among the cyber crime agencies and experts in India over the massive data breach. Okay, so all your name, your address, your numbers, your email IDs, etc., all this information is available on the darknet. This breach includes sensitive information such as names, address, email, contact numbers, home address, qualification, work experience, etc. of the job seekers. Such personal information could aid cyber criminals to conduct various nefarious activities such as identity theft, scams, and corporate espionage. Yes, very much possible. Okay, if they are having all of this data, if they do some another thing and get some additional data from you by faking certain things, then they could get involved into major crimes. Leak from the job sites. Though the exact source of the leak is not yet detected, the leak appears to have occurred from a resume aggregator services. So yet we are not in a position to trace it down, but some resume service aggregator, we have so many of them. Okay, so from them it might have leaked. This is a concern given the high popularity of such sites among the job seeking populace. Yes, nowadays everyone is going online, all the young people like you, okay, everyone who wants to get into the private sector, immediately you register yourself on these jobs sites, right? Your naukri.com, monster, and many are there. Okay, you might be aware, and some of that site that perhaps was hacked and this data was leaked, right? Now China suggests a shift in the BRI approach. BRI, their Belt and Road Initiative. Okay, earlier, or it is also known as one belt one road, OBOR initiative. Okay, but that was the earlier name. Later on China has shifted the name or changed the name to BRI initiative, that is Belt and Road Initiative. Okay, they don't want to call it one road one belt or one belt on one road initiative, because they think that perhaps that could cause misinterpretations by other countries. So BRI is the name which they are being using lately. A report notes that China's grants and loans totaled 354.4 billion between 2000 and 2014, of which 23% were grants, while the rest were commercial loans and market cost or close to market rates. Okay, so this is the amount of loans, 354.4 billion, which China has given to other countries. Okay, so China is giving loans to different countries for infrastructure, etc., development in their countries. The world's debt to China grew 10 times between 2000 and 2017, while developing countries owing 380 billion to China. Now, this is huge. Okay, this is huge, and this is what China is trying to do in its ambition to become a global power. They are trying to develop a China-centric development, connecting different developing countries and making them dependable on China for their development. Recently, China has faced calls from countries in Asia and Africa to delay or waive debt repayments because of economic challenges induced by COVID-19 pandemic. Now, see, China is very clever. Okay, whatever money they are giving outside, out of this, just 23% are given as grants. So grants means something like donations. You need not pay them back, but the remaining 77% is given out as loans. So they are also earning out of this. So something like they are building road somewhere in, say, some African country, say Kenya, and now they have given loan to them. The Kenya, now they are the majority of the time when they are building such things outside, Chinese company will be involved. So the Chinese company is also getting a job over there. They are also giving the loans. They are also getting the interest. Plus, that country which is getting the loans from China, that also becomes indebted to China. It also develops, say, political ties with China. So it's all a win-win-win game for China. Okay, through these mechanisms. Now, recently, due to this COVID-19 pandemic, obviously, these Chinese and African countries, developing countries, poor countries, are not in a position to pay back the EMIs. So, what has China done is China has hinted at a shift in how it will pursue its signature Belt and Road Initiative amid growing concerns about the debt repayments from the partner countries. Okay. Now, China has stated that it will focus on quality in the joint pursuit of the BRI. Instead of offering write-offs, China proposes to offer tailored plans, including rescheduling or increasing funding to help related projects resume operations and return profits. Okay. Now, many of these projects which China is carrying out, basically they are in those countries which are a part of this BRI initiative. Now, in this BRI initiative, I will show you the map. China wants to create a road connectivity right from China till Europe, as well as a sea connectivity again right from Chinese Sea, that is your South China Sea, till your Mediterranean Sea, and then connecting to Europe. Okay, and while doing so, whatever countries that are falling on these two routes, those countries, China wants to develop over there, right? And they want to increase trade with all these countries which are located on these routes. China has offered now over here, so they are giving grants or they are giving loans for whatever projects are there going on in these countries. Okay, and part of that will be also building these roads which are creating the connectivity. Now, since the default is occurring, China is very clever again. As I said, they are not writing off the loans, but they are rescheduling them. So maybe something like the moratorium given by RBI: don't pay for 3 months, don't pay for 6 months, but you pay after that. Okay, so your loan is not waived off. You have to pay it. Just now 6 months you need not pay, but after 6 months you have to pay, and further the term of the loan will be increased by 6 months to compensate for the present 6 months. And second, also what they have suggested is that okay, fine, right now you are in debt, you are not earning profits, we will give you more money. Okay, now by using that more money you start earning profits and then you repay the loans. Now again, it's a win-win situation for China. That country is getting more and more debted to China, and China will also receive more and more interest. China has offered adding grants to help bring projects back to life, conducting debt to equity swaps, or hiring Chinese firms to assist operations of the projects. Okay, so they have also offered that we will also give you grants, but when if there is debt to equity trust swap. Okay, so whatever that project is there, equity from that project would be transferred to say China. So again, a win situation. So over here you can see this. This is the map of the BRI, that is Belt and Road Initiative. So starting from China over here, okay, the road is going on. Here you can see, right? I will change this color. Okay, so see over here, this road, it is moving from China, okay, over here all the way around through the Central Asia. Then it's going to Russia, and then it's going to your European countries. So this is the entire patch, right? And whereas this is the sea route, okay, again starting from China over here, coming to all your Southeast Asian countries, then coming to India, Sri Lanka, again going to Africa, then over here through your Red Sea, through the Mediterranean Red Sea, and then further to the Suez Canal to the Mediterranean, and again connecting itself with Europe. And it wants to develop infrastructure in all these countries. It wants to increase the trading relations with all these countries, and obviously that entire thing, why is it doing it? It wants to become a superpower. So if obviously you have presence for development of infrastructure in so many countries around you, obviously that is going to push your claim for being a superpower in India. Now, apart from this, over here also China is building a road, right? You are aware of that. Okay, China Pakistan Economic Corridor. Okay, China Pakistan CPEC. Now that CPEC is this. Okay, CPEC is this, China Pakistan Economic Corridor. Fine. So this is your BRI, that is Belt and Road Initiative map. Now let's move to the next topic, heat waves. Indian Meteorological Department IMD has forecasted the heat wave to severe heat wave conditions over northwest, central, and adjoining peninsular India, along with heavy rain over northeast India. Okay, now we are really experiencing it right now in Pune. Also, I'm experiencing it a lot. Many of you are in Vidarbha, etc. Over there, the temperature has risen so much. Okay, Akola was in news for recording the fourth highest temperature in the world, right? Just 2 days back. Many parts of coastal Andhra Pradesh, Odisha, and Maharashtra have also observed increase in temperatures above 42 degrees Celsius, triggering heat wave conditions. Now that's huge, 42 degrees Celsius. The heat wave has been observed due to dry northwesterly winds prevailing over northwest and central India. Okay, so northwesterly winds coming, okay, in India from the Central Asia that are driving this heat wave in India. A heat wave is a period of abnormally high temperature more than normal maximum temperature that occurs during summer season in northwestern and south central parts of India. Heat waves are typically occur between March and June, yes, and in some rare cases even extend up to July. Now it depends upon how the monsoon arrives. Sooner the monsoon arrives, the heat waves will recede back. Later the monsoon arrives, more heat waves we will be facing. Higher daily peak temperatures and longer, more intense heat waves are becoming increasingly frequent due to climate change globally. Yes, that is happening. Overall, the temperature of the world is increasing, right? And that is causing a lot of heat waves world over. Criteria of heat waves. How is this heat wave defined? Scientific criteria for that is used by the meteorological departments that I have given over here. A heat wave is considered when the maximum temperature of a station reaches at least 40 degrees Celsius. Okay, for plains. Remember, it's for plains, and at least 30 degrees Celsius for the hilly regions. Okay, so for plains, it is minimum 40 degrees, and for hilly regions, it's minimum 30 degrees. Next, if the normal maximum temperature of the station is just less than or equal to 40 degrees Celsius. Now see, this criteria is for the region where the temperature is low, say somewhere normal temperature where is something around say 25 degrees Celsius or 28 or 30 degrees Celsius. For those stations, this is the criteria. But there might be few places where the normal temperature itself is something around 39 degrees Celsius or 40 degrees Celsius. Now over there, this can't be the criteria, right? So over there, if the normal temperature of a station is just less than or equal to 40 degrees, then an increase of 5 to 6 degrees from the normal temperature is considered to be an heat wave. Okay, so over there, perhaps 45, 46 degrees will be considered as a heat wave, right? Because over there, normal is something around 39, 40. Further, an increase of 7 degrees or more from normal temperature is considered as severe heat wave condition. Also remember this criteria. If the normal maximum temperature of a station is more than 40 degrees Celsius, then an increase of 4 degrees to 5 degrees from the normal temperature is considered to be heat wave. I've explained it over here only. Further, an increase of 6 or more is considered as severe heat wave conditions. So same thing. Additionally, if actual maximum temperature remains 45 degrees Celsius or more, irrespective of normal maximum temperature, a heat wave is declared. Okay, so these are the different criteria of declaring heat waves. For general studies, they won't go into such so much of detail, but this basic thing you should remember, that heat wave is declared when the maximum temperature of a station reaches 40 degrees in plains and 30 degrees in hilly areas. One thing. Okay, and then where it's normal around 40 degrees Celsius, then it has to be increased by another 5 to 6 degrees Celsius. Okay, and severe heat wave when there is an increase of 7 degrees Celsius. Okay, these are the three things which you could remember for GS. Okay, and that was all about today's discussion with respect to Hindu in the last week. We have covered all the important points. Fine. Now, if at all you have any questions, you can please raise your hand and we can discuss it. Hope all of you are studying well. Okay, I've stopped the sharing of the screen. Hope everyone is studying well. Okay. As we know discussed last Sunday, we won't be having any GS test on this Sunday, right? It has been suspended. The next two tests or four tests rather, GS as well as CSAT, they will be conducted when actual dates of your prelims will be declared. Okay. So we will be directly meeting on Thursday again for this session of Hindu Bytes. Acha, meanwhile, we are studying an interesting session in which officers from different services, senior officers around 10 to 12 years of service minimum, or maybe more than that, they will be coming and interacting with us on every Monday, preferably. And sometimes, if it's not, they are not available in Monday, some another day as per their availability. But basically, thing is that we will have one officer every day who will be interacting over here. So it will be some sort of an interview session. I will be interviewing them, and the focus would be on their career, whatever challenges they had faced in last 10, 12 years of their service, whatever their service has been. Okay, and then at the end, obviously, you will also have the chance to ask the questions. So very interesting. So on this Monday, we are having Nitin Yola. He's an IFS officer, 2009 batch. Okay, very expert person. Actually, he's an engineer, ENTC engineer from COEP Pune. He was working with ISRO as a research scientist. Just after his engineering, he was selected over there. Then he appeared for MPSC. He was selected as DYSP in first attempt. Then in UPSC first attempt, he was IRS. Second attempt, he became IFS. And most interesting about him is that he took Afghanistan by choice. Okay, the disturbed thing. Served in Afghanistan for 4 years, then in Sri Lanka for 3 years, and now he is posted in New Delhi, Ministry of External Affairs, handling the region of Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. So he will be there with us on this Monday at 9 p.m. So he's not available in the morning because his morning schedule is very busy. Uh, right. So he will be available in the evening, night actually, 9 p.m. on coming Monday, that is 1st of June. Nitin Yola sir, he will be in discussion. Okay, so please attend that. And these sessions are no, these are not just UPSC specific. You can ask any of your friends, relatives who are interested in knowing as to how what challenges this senior bureaucrats face. Anyone can see this. Okay, it will be more of a journey through their career in the past 10, 20, 30 years, whatever they have served. Okay, so not restricted only to UPSC. Anyone who is interested, they can watch this beautiful interaction. Okay, so I see no hands raised with respect to today's session. So I am assuming that there are no doubts. So let's end this session and let's meet on Monday uh, for the discussion with Nitin Yola sir at 9 p.m. Okay, I will be sharing the link on the group. Fine. So stopping now, right now. Chalo, bye. See you. Okay. Stay safe. Study well. Yes, stay safe. Though the lockdown restrictions have been removed, unfortunately the numbers are increasing. So please take care, take proper precautions, even if you are required to go outside. Right. Stay safe and keep on studying. Okay. Chalo then. Bye. See all of you on Monday. Bye.